So as part of our session today, in terms of preparing for the Biosciences Career Fair, I'm going to look at two elements. I'm going to look at the sort of the logistics of the fair, what you can do on Handshake and what you can do ahead of time to maximize your the benefit of the career fair. Then we're going to look at the resume aspect of it, because we do a resume book for this career fair. Not every career fair has a resume book, but we know the employers that come to this event do like to see that. So we share the resume book with employers ahead of time. You can put your resume out there. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit more of a general resume than one specifically for a role, but it's also a helpful. The advice I'm going to share is going to be helpful whenever it comes to using your resume. So the Biosciences Career Fair, as I said, it's going to be on Friday, the 26th of September. That you certainly can register on Handshake, and we encourage you to do so simply because we have a good sort of tracking of numbers of people interested in attending, but you don't actually need to register ahead of time. You can turn up on the day, so long as you have your pen card or your pen ID or your pen key, the first part of your email, we can get you logged into our system, get you your name badge, and get you into the event. You can have copies of resumes with you, but remember, you are a better version of your resume than your resume is of you. So as long as you have a nice, strong narrative about yourself, you're going to be in a good position to go to the career fair. You do want to have done some research ahead of time. We'll talk about that. And you do want to bring questions that you can engage the employers with so that you're learning from those conversations in an actionable way for how you want to position yourself for any opportunities. When you get to Handshake, you can register for the event. And then there's a few other things that you can do on the Handshake page that are going to be helpful. Eventually, we're going to put a map there of the space. We're only going to be in one room. We have about 30 employees this time, so we can fit nicely in one room. That map is going to look something like this. We're sort of updating this one still, so this is just a sort of a sample copy. But it's obviously going to give you an idea of where the employers are in the space. If you are someone like me with introverted tendencies and the whole career fair experience is just a slightly bit overwhelming, all those people clustered together, it's helpful to know exactly where you're going. So you're not wandering around trying to find people and sort of, increasing the likelihood that it becomes too overwhelming in terms of the sort of the social drain on your battery. So having a clear sense of which employers you want to engage with and where they are in the space is just going to be a reassuring way to sort of maximize your time at the event. You're also going to get a list of employers when you register on Handshake. When you click on these employers, you can do a few things. You can filter by things that you're interested in terms of the employer, right? So you can filter on things like, are they interested in, do they say they're interested in international students? Do they have internships? Do they have full-time opportunities? Are they interested in undergrads, masters, or PhDs, postdocs? These are preferences that the employers have. It doesn't mean that they don't want to see people who aren't these things necessarily, but when they set up their registration, they said, we have some opportunities and we would love to connect with these types of students or postdocs. If you are interested in an employer, but you don't fit one of the criteria that they have, you can still engage with them, right? You can still ask questions. They may not have a specific opportunity that they are there to talk about with you, but they can share other information as well. So as an example, this is Abbott, a medical device company. They're listing this clinical associates program as a job title. This is actually a job on Handshake as well. And they're saying that they are happy to connect with, or more happy to connect with, undergrads and masters. But if you are a PhD student, for example, and you wanted to learn about what opportunities might exist for someone with a PhD and advanced degree from that perspective, you can certainly come up to the table to the employer and say, hey, I know you're interested primarily in undergrads and masters. I have a PhD. I'm interested in this type of role. I know you have these types of positions on your website. Are you able to share any information about those opportunities? Right? And usually the answer would be yes. They can either share information, they can point you in the right direction. So I think in this case, just be acknowledging the fact that you know that they might have a preference that does not include your degree type or whatever it is, but you're still interested or still have questions. I think that's a great way of starting a conversation, without feeling like you cannot approach the table or get anything substantive from that. Now, there are going to be some organizations that say, we do not offer sponsorship, right, in whatever way that they list that. And so if you're an international candidate, potentially that it's going to be harder to apply for a role that may be a good fit for the visa limitations that you have. But having a conversation about what those recruiters at that organization are looking for, what skills they value, could still be something that you leverage in any other application that you make, whether it's to that organization or not. And sometimes what we found engaging with employers is that division, employer-wide, they may have one way of talking about, the fact that they do or do not sponsor, but in the individual departments or divisions, sometimes it's very inconsistent. I don't think it's necessarily uniform across a giant organization like, GSK or something like that, right? They have differences in the way that the different divisions or research areas work. So it's always worth exploring a conversation with an employee. You don't have to lead by saying, I'm an international student or an international postdoc. You still may be able to get information that is going to be helpful for you. So these are just things to bear in mind as you're looking at which employers are coming so that you can navigate that easily. Now, as I said, Abbott has posted this clinical associates program role. So if I click on the Abbott employer profile on Handshake, I can see that role there, clinical associates program. But I can also see a couple of other roles, right? And these are roles that they did not attach to their career fair registration. So when an employer registers, they can either put in a job title, just the words of the job title, or they can link it to a job that they have posted on Handshake. In this case, they linked the clinical associate program, but they didn't link the other two. Now, I don't know if it's because they don't want to talk about those, or the person who's coming has nothing to do with those, or they just clicked one and then they were done and they moved on to another task. So it's always worth looking on their website to see, or on the Handshake page, on their profile page on Handshake, also on their website to see what opportunities that they have. And the more that you can demonstrate that that they have certain opportunities that are open, and you can use that to start the conversation with the employer. Hey, I know that you have this position on Handshake, or hey, I saw this position on your website. Can you chat with me about that? Right. So just a little bit of background information there is going to be helpful. Okay, this is Calico Life Sciences here. So this is their employer page on the BioSciences career fair page. They're interested in everyone, juniors, seniors, masters, doctoral, postdoctoral, alumni. So they're very much open. They've included job titles here. These are not actual postings on Handshake. You might find that they are postings on their website, or they might just be the titles themselves, right? These are the types of roles that we're interested in chatting about at this career fair with any population who's interested in working with us, right? So basically that's what they're saying here. And so there's an opportunity for you to have a conversation depending on what your background is and your interest in any one of these particular roles. So this is all part of that background research that's going to make you feel very confident and optimistic about having meaningful conversations. And then just going back to that registration page on Handshake, you can click on the jobs tab there. That's going to show you the jobs that they have connected to their career fair registration. So this is not all the jobs that they have on their pages on Handshake, just the ones that they connected to the career fair registration. We're actually encouraging the employers to make sure that they are connecting as many jobs so that students and postdocs have the opportunity to look at those ahead of time. But it's up to the employers if they want to do that. The interesting thing about career fairs is that you're not always at a career fair to actually apply for a job, right? Because if you think about it, you're going to come to the career fair, you can have perhaps a paper copy of your resume, you may see a job online, and you may be tempted to say, here's my application for the clinical associate program role. But the chances of an employer wanting to take your, hard copy, your scrumpled hard copy at the end of the day and scan that into their system, and now it's a PDF and whatever it is, or an image file, the chances of them wanting to do that is quite small. Probably what they're going to say to you is make sure you apply online. And that's a question that you can certainly ask them, how best can I apply for this position? That can be part of your conversation. And that's actually good for you because part of the goal of a career fair is to gain information that's going to make you a better candidate for the roles that you're applying to. So what you learn from your conversations with a recruiter at a career fair can be something that you take back to your resume and make actionable changes to how you describe your skills, knowledge, and experience. And then when you do apply for the role that you're interested in, you're a much better candidate because of the conversation that you had with a representative at a career fair. So for sure, employers have opportunities that they're interested in talking about, but I wouldn't consider it I'm applying for this role. I would consider it as I'm gathering information so that when I do apply for this role, I'm going to be a much better candidate because of it. And so this leads us into this slide then, right? You don't even have to be looking for a job to be benefiting from a career fair. The conversations that you have about what skills that they're looking for or how they might see someone with a background in behavioral and decision sciences at their organization, if that's your background. These are all conversations that you might be able to have as part of your career exploration You might be a second year PhD. You might have, 4 more years to go or so. And you can still ask them, what types of skills would they recommend someone build if they're interested in these types of roles? So plenty of conversations can be had that sort of position you for the future, plenty of conversations that can be had that position you for an actual application that you're going to make in the next few weeks. Employers love to have engaging conversations, and that does mean that the more you can show that you've done your background research, the happier that they are. But if you show that you are interested and sort of engaged in the opportunities at their organization, they will respond, I think, in most cases, with a very positive, positive response and information that is going to be helpful to you. And then, after a career fair, there's opportunities to build on those relationships. And I'll give you a few pointers about how to do that in just a few slides. So we've touched on some of these things already in terms of some of the pre-work, right? You're going to look at the jobs that are posted, look at on Handshake. You're going to perhaps create a small, spreadsheet for yourself about the employers that you're most interested in, the jobs that you're most interested in that they have, the ones on Handshake, the ones on their website, and then some questions that you might have about those opportunities, right? So all of that information is pre-work that you can sort of be working through. Those questions are what you get to once you introduce yourself. And again, we'll run through the sort of the moment in time when you're doing your introduction in just a second. The resume deadline is coming up for the resume book. That's going to be on the 17th. So make sure that that's ready. So again, this is your pre-work. And then when you have a resume that you're happy with, you want to make sure that you've uploaded that as a document to Handshake and made it public so that employers can actually find it and find you on Handshake. And there's a good reason for doing that, right? So on Handshake, under your profile, you can change your privacy settings. And in most cases, because it's a outwardly facing platform that engages with employers, you want it to be as public as possible so that employers can find you. So that community option under privacy is the one that Handshake recommends, because that makes it easier for employers to find you. It also makes it easier for people within Penn to potentially find you through your Handshake profile. It's not as if you have to engage on Handshake a lot. So it's a good recommendation to have to make your profile at this community level of privacy. And then when you upload your documents, you can make that public too, so that when an employer gets to your profile page, not only can they see your summary, which is very much like your LinkedIn About Me section, they can also see your documents. Now, I was looking at my documents here, and I couldn't actually find a way to delete them, but then I was like, why on earth, back in 2018, did I upload a document called The Crow Who Said No? And it's a mystery to me as to what was going on in my life at that point in time. But anyway, make sure that you have an updated version of your resume. Make sure it's the only one that's visible that you want employers to see. Crow mentioning is totally optional. Now, the reason why having an uploaded resume and a public profile is important is that at every table you go to at the career fair, there's going to be one of these QR codes. This is something that Handshake generates that we put on each of the table. It's in a little sort of Perspex plastic holder. And when you come up to a table, it's a really good idea to check in at that table. So you just pull out your phone, you scan the QR code, and usually you type in your name or you sort of answer whatever questions are there. And what that means is that when the employers review their, after the career fair, when they review who they spoke to, the people who checked in will be in a nice list of people to see. It's not necessarily that they're going to remember you specifically by name, but if they wanted to scan through everyone who checked in and look for resumes or look to see if you have the skills that they're looking for, that's a smaller pool of people to look at than the whole, everyone who attended the career fair. So it's another way to engage with the employers after the fair, because the fair is busy, there's lots of talking, lots of activity going on. After the fair, a recruiter might sit down and say, let me review the people who I spoke with today and see if anyone stands out. And so that's going to be an opportunity for them to be able to see your profile and also see the resume that you've associated with that profile. Now, there's also going to be another way of encouraging an employer to connect with your information, and that's going to be by the thank you email, where you might remind them that you checked in so that they know to look for you there. Okay, so when you are at a career fair, what is it, 4 hours long or so? So, it's tiring for everyone involved. It's tiring for the recruiters, it's tiring for everyone. Socially draining for the people with introverted tendencies, socially recharging for those with extroverted tendencies. So it's best, obviously, to bring a positive energy to the table. The employers, they're excited to be there, but it is tiring. So that positive energy is how you introduce yourself, how you demonstrate that you've done some of the pre-work. We talked about that QR code as being an important part of the process. If you would like to shake hands with employers, it's sort of up to you and it's sort of up to them, right? So if they extend a hand and you're happy to shake their hand, that's perfectly fine. If you don't want to, because everyone's September time and colds and flus are just on the horizon, that's perfectly fine too. In most cases, when you approach a table, you are leading the conversation, right? So they're going to say, "Hi, welcome," and then it's going to be your turn to sort of do your introduction. Introduction is going to be fairly short, but obviously you want to make sure that they know your name. You're going to have a name sticker that comes when you register at the front desk. You tap your pen card, we give you a sticker. We recommend putting it on so the employers can see your name. So you're going to say your name, make sure that they know how to pronounce your name, and then sort of run through the main points. I have a PhD, I'm doing this, I have this background, I have these skills here. I'm really interested in moving into IP law. I've been doing some work with Penn Center of Innovation on this area, so I'm really excited that you're here. I have a couple of questions for you, right? And so your introduction sort of gives a nice overview, a nice summary of the main points that a recruiter should have in mind as they are answering the questions that you have. What you don't sort of want to do is to come resume in hand and then sort of say, "Here's my resume," right? And you sort of pass your piece of paper to them, because the first thing that will happen if you hand someone a piece of paper is they look down at the piece of paper, right? And you're no longer now engaging in conversation with them because they're sort of scanning through your document. Because you are a better version of your resume, you're more energizing and more optimistic about it. Hold the resume until you've done your introduction, and then you're able to then share the resume with them and say, "Here's just an overview of who I am, but I have a couple of questions for you." Because when you start asking them questions, right, then they have to engage with you and they're not going to look at the resume. Sometimes it's nice to leave them a resume, because I've seen employers make notes on resumes or tuck them into a pile, right? So it's not as if they'll never take it from you or never do anything with it. But in most cases, it's just a reference for who you are, which means that a sort of a one-page version of your resume, even if that's a sort of a summary, is probably helpful, or at least a back and forth, double-sided version of your resume might be helpful, just to keep it nice and concise. The questions then are the meat of the interaction that you're having at the career fair. This is where you're going to demonstrate that you have some advanced knowledge, or you've looked at stuff ahead of time and you're asking questions based on that knowledge. This is where you're going to walk away with the information that's most helpful to you. The one bit of feedback that we always get from employers at every career fair is that they do not like it when students or postdocs, PhDs, whatever it is, attend their table, come up to their table and say, "So what do you do?" Right? As if you don't know what the employer does or their functions or their roles, right? They really don't like that aspect. So make sure that your questions are about what you do know, and not what you don't know about an employer. So these are just examples of questions that you might be able to ask at a career fair. And I think I put these in the resources again, which I'll share in the chat here for anyone who came in just recently. So I'm not saying that these are the only questions that you want to ask, but these are definitely questions that help you have meaningful conversations, that allow you to walk away with something actionable that you can then do something with as you're updating your resume, or even as you are thinking about how best to prepare yourself over the next year before you actually apply for a role that you might be interested in. So keep these in mind. Look at the list on the handout that I put in the chat there for you. You can always use AI too to help you figure out what types of questions might be most relevant to you. So this, again, is just an example prompt of how you might generate some questions. Giving the AI tool, this is the employer, this is the information, this is the type of role that I'm interested in, the function of the role, this is my background, here's my resume. What are 30 questions that I could ask an employer at a career fair to walk away with something actionable? The great thing about AI is you can ask for 30 questions. You may only use 2 of them, but the 30 questions helps you brainstorm the types of questions that you could ask. So, it's just a nice way of sort of picking and choosing the ones that perhaps you don't have answers to, or that you never even thought to ask that might be relevant at a career fair. So AI prompts like this are just helpful as you are thinking about the types of questions that you might be able to ask. The sort of the narrative arc for your interaction, like the introduction, it comes first, the questions in the middle, and then you're going to want to wrap it up. Now, at an in-person career fair, how much time you have kind of depends on what's going on around you. If there's lots of people behind you, you're going to move through fairly quickly. If there's no one behind you and you're the only person there at the employer, you have a little bit of time to engage with them. I'm sure they'd rather have some conversation than no conversation, right? So you can sort of play it by ear there. So obviously you'd want to wrap it up by thanking them again for being there, and that the conversation was really helpful, that you really are interested in these types of positions. Certainly, if you feel like you had other questions, you might say, is there a way I can reach out to you after the event? Do you have a business card? Can I follow up with you? Most employers now seem not to have business cards, but certainly they might, or they might point you to a resource that has their email on it, or they might say, just follow up, on our website or something, which is shorthand for, don't follow up with me directly. But it's always worth asking just in case they are happy to do that. There are going to be some representatives at the employers that are probably alumni from Penn, right? And they'll have their name badge, but they'll also have an alumni ribbon just hanging down from behind that. So those might be people that might be worth following up with after a career fair. While they're at the career fair, they are representing their company, right? They're only talking about the roles and the responsibilities. If you're able to follow up with them after the fair, you might gain a little bit more about how they applied or why they applied there or what they like about that organization, right? A little bit more honest and a little bit more personal from their lived experience. Because they do have name tags on, it's always going to be worth taking note of names of the people that you spoke with, because there's not really a place that we have where you can access that name after the fair, because they might bring in representatives that we don't know about. The benefit of knowing names is obviously when you're writing a thank you email, you need to know who you're writing a thank you email to. But also in a future application, in a cover letter, the last paragraph of a cover letter typically states why this organization, why this role, why are you applying to this organization, what is it about this role? And so anytime that you can name drop in that last paragraph, you might say, I recently met with a representative so-and-so at the BioSciences Career Fair, and they were so helpful in describing your mentoring program for new hires, and that makes me even more excited about applying for this role. Right, if you can name drop someone, you do sort of bring yourself closer to understanding a little bit, or to them seeing you as someone who's more likely to fit in with their organization. Right, you've done some of the work, and it just from a psychological perspective makes you feel more familiar as you might be applying for that role. So name dropping is really important, and it's a good use of your time to sort of capture those names. How you do that, piece of paper, on your phone, whatever you need to do. Just keep in mind that information will evaporate very quickly if you don't write it down. So see if you can keep track of that. And then if you didn't scan the QR code ahead of time, make sure you scan that before you leave the conversation. And sometimes they have freebies on their tables and you can grab those and whatever else you need to do there. So again, just reiterating some of the reasons why career fairs can be helpful. No matter what sort of stage of your program or degree that you're in, employers like to have engaging participation at career fairs. The more engaging the students are, the more likely it is that they'll return for future career fairs. So even if you're not on the job market right now, engaging with employers, making them feel valued for being there is going to be a good investment, because they're more likely to come back to this career fair or a similar career fair at Penn in the future if they had a good time now. It's a great opportunity to learn a little bit more about the organization, about their sort of their culture, about their roles, about their internships, also about timelines, right? When are they going to be posting jobs? What are the trends that they're seeing in terms of hiring or numbers? When are the internships going to be posted, right? So lots of things that you can glean from that. Even if you're not applying right now, it's a great opportunity to practice your pitch in a fairly safe space, right? You're not interviewing for a role, so you can introduce yourself, you can try out different ways of describing your skills, knowledge, and experience to see how those sound, and that'll be a great way for the employers to get a sense of who you are. And then we talked about this idea that following up potentially with alumni afterwards can be a great way of keeping the conversation going, and maybe doing sort of an informational interview, right? Finding someone who's in a role that shares a background similar to yours, who you can learn more about, whose experience you can learn more about, that might be actionable to you in some way. So we have this informational interview guide. You can see that in the link of links that I shared. And then these are some of the questions that might be helpful as you're thinking about writing resumes when you're connecting with people in roles, right? So again, after the career fair, having these one-on-one Zoom conversations or phone conversations or a coffee chat, and just saying, what types of skills do you leverage in your role to make you successful? And then thinking about whether you've highlighted those skills in your resume right now, or whether those are skills that you might build over time. The whole process of talking to people at a career fair or beyond helps you build language that you can use to describe your experiences in a more relevant way. So if you're chatting with a recruiter and you ask them what jumps out at a resume from them, what types of experiences do they love to see, however they describe those experiences, that's language that you can borrow to describe your experiences. So just make sure that you're paying attention to the way that they describe what they're excited by and what they're doing, because that language is powerful when it comes to showcasing how your skills are relevant to a role that you're applying to. Okay, so wrapping up after the career fair then, it's great to be able to send a thank you email because it's a way to keep the conversation going. When it comes to networking, people are always asking, well, I met someone, but how do I keep that going? So a thank you email is always a perfect way of, step number one. And I'll give you some text to what that email might look like in just a second. So once you have their name, you can look to see if their email is available on Handshake, or you can look to see if their email is available on their website. If they're an alum, you can see if their email is available on MyPen, the Penn alumni database. You can use CareerShift, which I'll send you a link to as well, that allows you to find professional email addresses for people at their work, right? So you can find all these ways to get an email, and you can send a thank you email just to wrap up the conversation. It makes that person feel good to get a thank you email saying, hey, I really appreciated you being at the career fair. If you've identified skills from the conversations that might be helpful, you can take those skills and think about how you can build those skills, what you need to do to make yourself more competitive for the future. You have information that you can make your resume better. You can name drop people in the cover letter, as we talked about. So these are all great next steps. This is, again, just an example of what a thank you email might look like once you've found their email. And again, you're not going to find everyone's email necessarily, but the ones that you can find is a really good way of wrapping up the conversation. You're going to thank them, talk a little bit about who you were. I was the person who asked you this, right? Because they may not remember you specifically, and they may not even remember you after this conversation, after this thank you email. But you can say, I scanned in on the app, so you should be able to find me there. Or you might say, hey, I've attached my resume just for your information so that you have an electronic version of it, right? So there's lots of ways that you can sort of get the information to them without it seeming like, you're sort of applying for a job. You're really just following up and thanking them for being there. Now, the fair's on Friday, so, everyone's going to be traveling home over the weekend or traveling back to where they work. So I think if you sort of land the thank you email on the Monday, you're in a good position there. MyPen and CareerShift, again, I've shared links to how you can use those tools to be able to track down emails that might be helpful for a thank you email. Okay, so we've made it to the resume best practices. As I said, I like to move through these presentations at speed, so hopefully that was helpful. A lot of the resources that I talked about there that you want to take a look at, they're in that link. I'm going to keep posting it because people jump into the session. But let's talk now about resumes. So a resume is a very skills-focused document, and you really want to make sure that it paints a very clear picture in the mind of the reader of your skills in action. And not just any skills, obviously, but the relevant skills, relevant to the roles that you're applying to or that you would like to apply to in the future. So the skills have to be the main sort of selling point for the resume. And it will look different depending if you're applying for different types of roles that are out there. So it's an adaptable document. You can submit your resume on the resume book. It's on the career fair page. Hopefully you've seen links to that in some of the other emails, but you get to choose which of these categories you want to be in. I'm an undergrad looking for internship. I'm an undergrad looking for full-time. So you can sort of throw them in there depending on what suits your need. If you're looking for both for whatever reason, then you can put your resume in both. And then we'll share these with all the employers ahead of the career fair. They may reach out directly. They may just keep an eye on those for future. They may not look at them at all. But again, you can remind the employer that you did submit your resume so that they know it's out there if you want to do that. In a career fair, especially when you're giving a summary of yourself, you are actually focusing on sort of the main takeaways from your resume, your high-level conclusions. And so you can do this in a resume too by having what I would call a summary section. The summary section is somewhat different from a profile. A profile just says, here's who I am and what I want. Whereas a summary section is much more focused on, these are the takeaways that I need you to have about this resume specific to the type of role that I'm excited by, right? So sometimes in resume appointments with students or postdocs, I ask, what do you want the reader to take away from this resume? And for some people, that's actually a hard question to answer. They've never actually thought about what the main takeaways are. And the challenge there is if you don't know what your takeaways are, then a reader's never going to know what your takeaways are because they haven't lived your life. So making sure that you've really boiled it down to, I need them to know that I have knowledge of this, that I'm experienced doing this, that I can lead and manage programs, and that I'm excited about doing this in the future, right? Those might be some of your main conclusions that you want to point to. That's going to help, especially at a career fair, because there's no time for them to read the document while you're standing there, but they can certainly read 4 bullet points while they're doing a quick look at it. And that might remind them and integrate into their consciousness the things that you want them to know about you. So these are just examples of the different types of high-level summary bullet points that might sit at the top of a resume, right? These are not necessarily a single person. I've just sort of coupled together different types of thematic bullet points. But they do sort of get to this idea that these are the main takeaways that are going to be demonstrated in action in the main part of the resume, right? Much like a scientific paper, you're going to have conclusions at the end, but you can't just come up with those conclusions out of the blue, right? They have to be supported by the data. They have to be supported by the discussions that you've made about the data. So in your resume, the summary statements, the 4 or 5 main thematic bullet points are going to be supported by evidence in the experience section of your resume, right? But these are just examples that you might sort of find to be helpful at, sort of sit at that high level part of the resume. Making the relevant things pop out is also going to be a good skill set to have. So this is just an example of a resume, right? So this is education section. This is a MES student, Master's of Environmental Studies. They have their capstone thesis and they have their coursework listed. Perfectly good to include in the education section. If the type of role that they're looking for was more along the lines of a sustainability analyst, there are some keywords here, keywords that the applicant tracking software robots would pick up, but perhaps not a reader who's looking at this quickly, because they're sort of buried within the coursework section, right? So they're looking for sustainability, they're looking for GIS skills, those things don't pop out. An easy fix to that when you're trying to prioritize those skills would be just to rearrange the order so that the things that the reader cares about the most are the things that they see the first, right? And the quickest, right? That really helps them pick up the main themes of the resume without having to read through everything that's out there. Same with the skill section. So in this skill section, perfectly good skill section, sort of an engineering style resume. If a job or a function wants C++ and SolidWorks as skills, they're both mentioned there, right? So that's great, but you could really prioritize those things just by moving it to the front. Now, because these might be skills that are really relevant to a role, not only should they be listed as skills, they also want to be shown in action within the experience section. So you're sort of going to double up on them, right? So you're going to list them as skills, get the keywords there, but in the experience section above, you're going to show those skills in action so that the reader really has a clear idea about how those skills can be, how you've used those skills successfully. This is a relevant experience section. This person has been a lab assistant and a clinical research assistant, but the role that they are interested in perhaps is a more data-focused role, more healthcare data, for example, something along those lines. And so the performing image capturing may be less relevant to those types of roles, but the filtering the large amount of data generated or using a tool to do that may be more relevant. So again, just a little bit of reorganizing so that the bullet points capture the priority of the reader, not what you did. You might have only spent 10% of the project time doing the data analysis and 90% doing the image capturing. But as you're talking about what's a relevant skill, you can reorder and reprioritize how you describe it so that the reader's needs are met first, right? Because you want them to see that you have these skills quickly so they don't lose interest or don't lose the thread of your resume. So just small things can make a big difference as you're formatting the document moving forward. When it does come to structuring the bullet points, skill, context, outcome is a fairly good formula to use to make that happen. So here's the relevant skill that I used, here's the context in which I used it, and here's the outcome that is connected to the skill that I used, right? So if you can formulate these mini skill stories as part of your resume, then it becomes a very strong narrative. The more relevant the context is to a type of role that you're applying to, the more you can talk about it. The less relevant the context is, the more you want to focus on the skill itself, because the skill is always going to be transferable to a role, but whatever project you are working on may not be the type of projects you'll be doing moving forward. So you don't want to spend too much time on the context. You want to spend more time demonstrating how you use that skill to achieve the outcome. And the context is just there to support the narrative in the document. Sometimes when people write these bullet points, if you see a half-line bullet point, it only covers half the line, it only has about 6 to 8 words, it's probably not going to tell a complete skills story. So these are just examples, right? So you have a sense of what's happening, but you don't really have a clear image in your mind. If they're your bullet points, you probably do have a clear image because your brain is filling in all the gaps, right? Your brain was there, it remembers. It's like, yes, I did all these things. But the reader who doesn't know you and isn't your brain just has this information, and by itself, it's not enough. So you really want to increase the specificity of the experience so that the reader pictures that skill in action. And the clearer the image in their mind, the more likely it is that they can imagine you in the types of roles that they may be hiring for. So these are just examples, out of the blue, as it were, in terms of STEM experiences that are much more specific, right? The skills are clear. One's collaborating, one's problem solving, one's sort of managing, and then the context is just enough to make it make sense without getting in the way, and then the outcome sort of connects with the skill, right? So if you're a PhD, outcome might be a publication, but that's not the only outcome. It might be an ongoing collaboration. It might be a new research question that you're asking, right? There's lots of different ways of pointing to outcomes that are more directly connected to the skill in question. So again, these are just examples to illustrate some of the ways that you can put together your content in the resume. Now, there are plenty of samples on our website or resources on our website that you can take a look at. So this is the How to Write Resumes page on our website. You can see that there are samples across the different degree populations that we serve, undergrads through postdocs. So do take a look at those. You'll find some template. You'll see the resume guide for graduate students. It's a new one that we have out for graduate students. All of these are resources that you can leverage as you are putting together your resume. In terms of formatting, the temptation to squeeze as much as possible onto a single page is very high because you want to feel like it's concise. But if there's no white space, it's almost impossible for the reader to take on board the information clearly. You always need mental spaces where you can take a mental breath of fresh air before you're looking at the next section. It's sort of the difference between walking down the path on the left or the path on the right, right? Everyone likes the right because there's a nice breeze coming through between the trees. And that's what you're sort of trying to do with your resume, right? Making sure that there's enough space so that the sections are clearly differentiated and maybe slightly smaller spaces within each section, just to have enough space for a break, but not overwhelming the reader by cramming it all together or having it too stretched out, right? Which sort of stops the information from being connected together in helpful ways. So just examples, right? You can choose your own formatting. These are just examples of what you can be doing. Formatting also helps prioritize information, right? So in this case, this is this is the education section for an engineering student here at Penn. What's bolded in this top example is the University of Pennsylvania, perfectly good thing to bold, and Philadelphia, PA, which probably doesn't need to be bolded because that's the least important part of this. What's not bolded is the degree, right? That's put in italics, and italics does not make things pop out of a resume. Italics makes things hide, sort of makes it harder to see rather than easier to see. So using the same information, this is a sort of a reformatted version where the bolding focuses on the things that you want the reader to know about. I want them to know I have a master's in bioengineering and from the University of Pennsylvania. Philadelphia, PA, and my graduation date, that's less important. So it becomes then less critical to sort of bold those types of things. So hopefully, even the choice of font, right? The bottom one doesn't have the serifed font with the twiddly bits on the end. And it takes up much less sort of space, but is much more direct and easy to read than the one above it in most cases. Dates, I focus on this because it's something that my brain always focuses on. I guarantee if you look at your resume right now, your hyphen between your dates is not consistent. Sometimes it's big hyphen, sometimes small, sometimes with spaces, sometimes without. The only reason this is truly important, because in the grand scheme of things, surely this can't be important, but the only reason it does become important is when you do actually apply for a job and you're one of the top 30 candidates, 20 candidates for the role, but they need to get it down to 3 people to interview. And so they start looking for reasons to throw resumes out of the pile, right? And if everyone's equally qualified, it's really, really hard. So you look for arbitrary reasons. This one has a typo in it. This one, is inconsistently formatted. Because then they start saying, well, if you can't format a one-page document properly, what does that mean for this $1 million project that you'd be working on in this organization, right? So don't get kicked out of contention because of a small inconsistency in your formatting. Spend the time, make sure that it's as perfect as you can make it so that no one ever notices that you spent all that time making it perfect. And then remember that the resume is the outcome of a lot of the networking that you're doing. Once you've gathered information about organizations, about their roles, about what they're looking for, had conversations with alumni about their experience and what they learned from it, then you're going to have a much better set of information to write a resume. It's going to save you so much time at the end of the day putting together effective resumes because you've done all the groundwork first. The content of your resume is critical, right? It's really what the people spend the most time on. It's what the applicant tracking software is looking for in terms of keywords. The formatting is less important, but it's truly important only when it does its job of not getting in the way, right? I should never notice the formatting of a resume. It should never come to my mind that this is a poorly formatted or a really excitingly formatted document, because the nature of the formatting is not as important as what you've done. So content first, formatting, just make sure that I can see the content without interruptions. And then the last one is sort of the bigger picture version of you, the things that you're doing outside of your resume that make you memorable. At a career fair, that's your narrative, that's your energy, that's your demonstrating that you've done the background research, that's asking the smart questions, and then being proactive with your follow-up and your thank you emails, right? Those things will be more important than the resume that you hand them. So make sure you've invested enough time in that process as well.